Hey y'all, howdy. Welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandra Broadwell and happy spooky season. It's finally that nice crisp time of year and it just makes me want to cozy up and read some spooky books. So this is it, my third year in a row of doing a Halloween vlog. Last year I did a reading 5 vampire classics video. So I read Carmilla, Dracula, Salem's Lot, Interview with a Vampire, and I Am Legend, which all came out in the 1970s or earlier. So this year I'm going with mostly more modern books, but I am throwing one classic in there, but only one vampire book this year. So I thought it'd be a great idea to just continue the theme of last year's vlog by kicking it off with the vampire book of the vlog, and that is going to be The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This is also going to be one of 5 books for this vlog. However, none of the rest of them are vampire books. The rest of the books for this video are going to be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I'm very excited to knock out of my 40 classics to read before I turn 40 video list. We Spread by Ian Reid, which is a book that is about a woman who is taken to a senior care facility and things become very sinister and dark. I'll also be reading What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher, which is the sequel to What Moves the Dead, which I read last year. What Moves the Dead was a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, and What Feasts at Night is T. Kingfisher's sequel that is veering completely away from the original Edgar Allan Poe story, but is still following the same characters that she created in the What Moves the Dead story originally. So I'm very excited to see where that goes because I thought the world building and the characters in that book were super interesting. And finally, the 5th book for this video is going to be Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. I have no real concept of what this is about other than I can assume based on the title alone that it's going to be about some killer mannequins potentially that come to life. But I read The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones last year. It was my first book by him and it made it onto my top 10 best books of the year. Absolute banger. So I am so excited to try something else by Stephen Graham Jones and see if I like it just as much. So those are the 5 books for the video. Let's go ahead and dive in because I have already started the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and I want to talk about it. So as I'm updating you guys, I am on page 179, which is almost halfway through. What captured me about this book right away was the author's note, which was right at the beginning of the book. The author, Grady Hendrix, talks about how basically when he was a young person, how he completely disregarded his mom and all of her friends, and he thought they were just kind of frivolous people. He didn't really understand all of the hard work that they put in as housewives to take care of him and their family and all of the things that were going on behind the scenes that really made his whole life function. And so this book is kind of paying homage to those sorts of women like his mom who actually were doing all of the things all of the time, and he was just too self-absorbed as a teenager to realize it. So the last few sentences of his author's note, I'll read you to just give a taste of what this book is like. It says, "With this book, I wanted to pit a man freed from all responsibilities but his appetites against women whose lives are shaped by their endless responsibilities. I wanted to pit Dracula against my mom. As you'll see, it's not a fair fight." By that alone, I was just absolutely hooked. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read this. It's set in the early 90s. The main character is a woman who is a housewife, who is a mom of two kids who are in middle and high school. And she joins a book club of other women in her well-off neighborhood. They mostly read true crime sorts of books and stories. They're very fascinated by serial killer Ted Bundy type characters, and a man moves into their neighborhood and suddenly, over the next few months, strange things start happening in the neighborhood and children are going missing. And as you can imagine, based on the title, yes, Batman is a vampire, but they're just at this point in the book, at the 178 pages in, is really when she knows for sure that he is the culprit behind all of the weird things that are going on, but she just figured it out and now she has to act. It is so good. I'm literally like thinking about this book all the time when I'm not reading it. My husband and I have been helping out with the Hurricane Helene relief efforts for the last week or so, and that's been really, really tough. We are in Western North Carolina where everyone was hit really, really hard, and that's been really heartbreaking. So having this book to fall back on and kind of pull me out of the seriousness and the 16-hour days that we've been putting in trying to help out and help our neighbors is just really been such a huge relief. So not only am I enjoying this book for itself, but I'm also just been enjoying this book because it's a nice reprieve from the seriousness of my real life right now. But yeah, it feels pretty addictive. Patricia, the main character, is kind of neglected by her husband, who's constantly at work, and he doesn't really take her seriously when she tells him about these weird things that have been happening. He kind of underplays everything that she has to say, and her kids are at that age where they don't really want to listen to her anymore either. And so her really one good like social reprieve is her book club, where she can feel like a real person for a little while and have adult conversations with people who listen to her. And so she's been in this book club now at the halfway point. She's been a part of this neighborhood book club for 4 or 5 years now and has become very, very close with these women. So I'm interested to see in the second half of the book how those other women potentially get pulled into the vampire plot, because so far she's the only one that knows what's really going on. And I'm not even sure she fully knows what's really going on, but she has started to understand what's going on. So that's all super cool and fun, and I just love kind of the tone of this book. I don't feel like the characters or the setting are like super jumping out at me the way I kind of almost expected this to feel a bit like Salem's Lot by Stephen King, which I read last year in that vampire blog that I mentioned. Salem's Lot was just like exquisitely atmospheric and really made me feel like I knew every single character, even if they were only on page for a few paragraphs. I don't necessarily feel like that in this book. Characters, the women in the book club, do blur together a little bit for me still at this point in the halfway point of the book, but I'm starting to be able to distinguish them a little bit more clearly. But the vibes are still really good, and I do love the like early 1990s, like Charleston, South Carolina, Southern setting. It's very fun. So that's what I have to say so far. I'm probably gonna finish this book. Well, I have half of it left, so we'll see. I'm going to read a lot of it today. If I don't finish it today, I'm definitely going to finish it tomorrow. So I will tune in with you guys then and let you know what my final thoughts are. Okay, I'm on page 218 right now, so I'm not even like a crazy amount farther than I was when I updated you last time. But I just finished chapter 21, and let me tell you, the white hot rage that I feel at how these men in this book treat their wives, of how everything that they say is frivolous and that they're just silly housewives with too much time on their hands. I was literally reading this chapter and my stomach was like twisting itself into knots over how mad I was. And I just like I wanted to just punch them all in their stupid fictional faces. Anyway. Yeah, I don't even know what else to say. I just like, okay, I have to keep reading. I have to find out what's going to happen next. Welcome to day 2 of the vlog. It's Saturday, October 5th, and I did finish the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires last night, but decided to wait till today to update you guys so the lighting would be better. This was absolutely fantastic, and I really loved the social commentary wrapped up in this book. It's not in your face, but it's just like weaved throughout the story of the misogyny of how men treated their wives in the 1990s, especially potentially in the South. Also, there were a lot of race dynamics at play, in that the only black characters that you really saw in this book were basically like house cleaners for these wealthy white people, and that part of the reason the vampire was so successful in this community was because he started out by preying only on black children, and because white families were not in danger, the police didn't take it seriously for so long. And how eventually that is the reason that this community got in so deep and so many people were harmed before these white Southern women could finally snap out of it and get their shit together. So I just loved all of that. I also loved how there were so many red flags that they did pick up on quite early in the story, but because of their Southern roots and their Southern hospitality that's so ingrained in the culture, that they were really held back from being able to take action because it would be improper, or, you know, it would cause a scandal, and potentially, you know, if they were wrong, it could definitely like embarrass them and their families and ruin, you know, their husbands' jobs and things like that. And so all of that sort of thing about how underestimated housewives are, but how actually strong and resilient they are, because they have so many responsibilities behind the scenes, and they really are doing all the things all the time to keep the world afloat, and, you know, or their families afloat at least, and, you know, how they come together at the end to slay the vampire, obviously. So yeah, I just thought that that was so well done, and I will definitely be picking up more books by Grady Hendrix in the future, just because this one was so much fun. Last night, I also went ahead and dove into my second pick, which is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And so far, this one it's feeling a lot like a lot of classics I have read, where instead of us following the main character of the story, which would have been the more interesting choice, we're following the perspective of a random sort of side character that happens to be there witnessing the events. And so it's almost like a lot of classic authors from, you know, well, way back in the day, felt the need to explain, like, this is a story as it was like explaining the story more from like a normative or like everyman sort of perspective. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is told from the perspective actually of Dr. Jekyll's lawyer, who is also a close friend of his. And the lawyer is concerned that Dr. Jekyll's will is very strangely written, and says that if he was to suddenly disappear or be killed, that all of his possessions and estate would go to a mysterious Mr. Hyde figure. And he's been friends with Dr. Jekyll for a very long time, and he has no idea who this Hyde character is. And so he decides to kind of investigate it for himself, because he's heard some weird things about Mr. Hyde. And when he does encounter Mr. Hyde for the first time, he's very like put off by this person. He seems very strange, he seems very mean, and it just kind of gives him the chills, like how inhumane this person is, and definitely gives him like a sense of evil. The story is following this lawyer as he tries to figure out what's going on with this Mr. Hyde character, and then someone in their town is murdered, and a witness saw it and said that Mr. Hyde was the murderer, and so things kind of spiral from there. But really, I do feel like this book would be much more interesting from the perspective of Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Things have unraveled pretty quickly. It's a very short story, so I imagine I'll be tuning in later today with my final thoughts once I wrap this up. I just finished Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'm giving it 2.5 stars. This is one of those classics that's told with a inexplicable
unimportant character as the narrator, and like I mentioned earlier, it's the lawyer for Dr. Jekyll. And the whole thing's from his perspective up until the end, basically, and he gets a letter from Dr. Jekyll kind of explaining what happened from his perspective, and then at the end of the letter, the book is over. There's no reflection on the part of the narrator slash lawyer. There's no like conclusion whatsoever. It's just like the letter ends and the book is over. So that was really weird. Also, I've noticed that though with like several classics that I've read lately, like The Metamorphosis, where it's just like, and that's how it ends and it's over. So definitely different styles of writing that I'm glad are no longer popular. Also, deformity was linked to ugliness and evil and depravity multiple times throughout the story, so obviously not politically correct in today's era. But I did find the story overall to be fascinating. Obviously, it's a classic for a reason. Basically, Dr. Jekyll, he tried to separate human nature into its pure good and pure evil components. However, he only succeeded at separating pure evil, and so he basically created an evil version of himself, which was Mr. Hyde. And in the face of pure evil, a normal human man like Dr. Jekyll could not face up against the immorality and the depravity that he was up against, and he couldn't fight against it adequately. And so by the end of the story, he succumbs to pure evil. So that's the premise of the story. It was definitely different than any of the like adaptations that I've seen, where Mr. Hyde is often portrayed as like a large monster of a man, but in this one he was actually much shorter than Dr. Jekyll and wasn't really monstrous, but just made people kind of feel uneasy around him. So anyway, it was fine. I don't necessarily like recommend going out of your way to read it unless you were already interested in reading it. But next up, I already have Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones checked out from the library and queued up on my Kindle. So I'm going to go ahead and start that one this evening. And I think that's also a novella. So there's a chance I could also finish that this evening, but I will probably update you guys tomorrow if that's the case. See you then.
To about the 50% mark of Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones last night, and as I should have assumed from my experience reading The Only Good Indians, the story goes in a direction I completely was not expecting, and it is just so unhinged. Basically, the premise is that the main character is a high school sophomore, and he has a group of like 5 friends, I think, that one of their friends has a job at a local movie theater, and they decide to play a prank on this friend by dressing up a mannequin, essentially bringing it into the movie theater, and then they call to complain in the middle of a movie that someone just snuck into the theater. And so they're expecting their friend to basically come in and find the mannequin, right? Things obviously get very strange very quickly, because person that comes in to see, like, check everyone's movie stub tickets just walks right past the mannequin and like confirms their ticket without seeing anything. And then at the end of the movie, all the friends like sat in different parts of the movie theater so that they wouldn't get caught. At the end of the movie, when the credits roll, the mannequin gets up and walks out of the theater. Soon after that, one of the group of 5 friends dies, and then the main character is convinced that it is the mannequin that's coming after them. That's the setup for how I expected the story to go, and then very quickly after that, it takes a turn. and it's not the story that I thought it was. And I love Stephen Graham Jones' ability to just flip the script like that. So I can't really reveal anything else without giving it away, but it is a wild ride so far, and I'm really having a good time. So I'll update you guys again at the end of the story and let you know how it went. So I did just finish Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. It was absolutely unhinged, as no one is surprised. I love that author's ability to just take the concept that you think you're reading and just flip it on its head and go completely off the rails. It was fantastic. It was a very like teen slasher type of concept, and it was just a really good time. I wish there had been a little bit more finality to the conclusion. There was like a little bit more that I wanted in terms of like the last few pages, but otherwise it was really, really fun, and I'm really glad that I picked it up. It was really short, like 120 something pages, so if you're looking for a fun, quick slasher style read, this is the one for you. And I think next up I'm going to be reading What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher. Last night I got to the halfway point of What Feasts at Night by T. Kingfisher, which is the sequel to What Moves the Dead. This one so far is kind of slow, especially I think compared to my expectation based on how What Moves the Dead went, but it is following the same main character. They are traveling back to their homeland to go stay at the hunting lodge that their family owns, and they're hosting the mycologist that they met in the first book as a guest in their small country. And when they get there, the hunting lodge has been abandoned, and they're not sure what happened to the person that they paid to keep up the lodge. And then they investigate and find out that that person died like 2 months previously, and the townsfolk are reluctant to talk about it. But it turns out that the townfolk think that this like mythological like folktale type creature is what killed this person. And so, you know, creepy hunting lodge in the woods vibe with some sort of mysterious folklore creature rumored. That's kind of what's going on. We're halfway through the book, and one of the people who they hired to caretake the facility has fallen very ill, and, you know, what's causing it? It looks like the same thing that happened to the previous caretaker. So it's a little bit mysterious, but it's not as dark or creepy feeling as I would have hoped by this point in the story. So I'll finish it up and let you guys know my final thoughts. So last night I finished What Feasts at Night, and then started and got halfway through We Spread by Ian Reid. So one at a time. The second half of What Feasts at Night definitely picked up, and that's pretty much what I expected. I will say around the halfway point when I last checked in, I was feeling more of like a 3-star kind of vibe, but I just absolutely love T. Kingfisher's writing. It feels so cozy to me, even if the story isn't necessarily cozy, and I just had a really fun time with the second half of the book. So it's definitely a 4-star read. I definitely didn't like it as much as What Moves the Dead, but I did like the recurring characters, the more development and backstory we got with some of them, and I thought that the folklore creature that was involved in the story was really cool, as well as just kind of the questioning that all the characters were really going through about whether they believed in this monster or whether they thought it was just some sort of sickness that was going around. I liked all of that. I thought the conversations to be had around PTSD and the effect that war can have on a person, I think were really poignant and just said in a really unique way. I think one of the things that I really liked that the main character said was that people who aren't in war talk about war as if it is an event with a start and end date, but people who are a part of war think of it, at least people with PTSD, think of it more as a place, and that just because you're not thinking about it anymore doesn't mean it's not still there. It's more like a place that you are in the war sometimes, and sometimes you're not. So I just really liked all of those conversations. So yeah, T. Kingfisher is great, and I'll definitely be reading more of her works in the future for sure. Now I am reading We Spread by Ian Reid, and this is about a woman who's very old. It doesn't say actually how old she is, at least up to this point it hasn't yet, but she's old to the point that falling is a major concern, losing her memories is a major concern. She's very elderly and frail and has lived alone for quite some time since her life partner passed. But she was an artist, her partner was an artist, and she used to have this really vivid life. And so the first part of the story, the kind of introduction to the character, is just kind of her sad reflection on what her life is now, where she just like sits in her chair all day and watches TV, and she eats cold soup out of a can, and she can't sleep at night, she hardly eats anything, she never interacts with anyone, and that kind of stuff. But she hears people next door while she's trying to sleep, and she thought that apartment had been empty, but she hears them like multiple nights in a row. And then she finally falls doing something she shouldn't have been trying to do by herself. And it's not until her landlord finds her like the next day that she's able to get up off the floor. Because of that, it triggers her being sent to live in this elderly assisted living facility, which the landlord tells her that her and her partner had chosen many years before and made all these arrangements ahead of time when she was no longer able to live on her own, that they didn't want her to have to worry about that. She doesn't remember any of this, and so she feels like she's being taken away from the only home that she knows and remembers for the last 25 years, and it's all very sudden. She didn't know this was going to happen, and so she feels very put out at first. Then she goes to the facility, and it's very small and intimate. It's kind of a unique situation. There's like 2 caretakers, and there's only 3 other elderly people living there besides herself. It's a very hands-on, they want you to feel like family type of place. She very quickly makes a connection to one of the other elderly gentlemen living there and starts to feel suddenly like maybe there's more to life after you think your life is over and you're just waiting around to die. Like suddenly she's having these revelations that like maybe her life doesn't have to be over just because she can't really do much anymore, that she can be a part of a community again, and she suddenly is like sleeping better and eating a lot more and all that kind of stuff, and it's making her feel a lot of more vitality. On the other hand, there seems to be a little bit of sinister vibes underneath all of this because she is having such a hard time with her memory. Sometimes she thinks they put her to bed without dinner, or one of the caretakers was like cutting her hair and then suddenly it was the other one, and the first one didn't say goodbye. She didn't know why the other one came in, and it was like, was that person there all along? Was she just imagining that it was the other person at first? There's just slowly some sinister vibes creeping in now that she is settled at this facility and feeling comfortable that maybe everything is not okay actually. But we as the reader don't really know, is this her memory or is something actually sinister going on? So it's really intriguing. I've flown through the first half of the book. Here we are. It's the last clip of the Halloween vlog this year. Wow. It's been a long time actually since I've filmed, so I did finish We Spread by Ian Reid, I think the next day following when I last filmed. So much has happened since then. I filmed most of the vlog within like a few days at the beginning of the month, and now it's almost the end of the month and I gotta wrap this up. We Spread was a 5-star read for me. I absolutely loved it. The kind of psychological questioning that was happening throughout the entire book for both the character and myself, the reader, was so fascinating. It felt sinister, but you never really got clear answers about whether things were happening or whether it was all in her head. And I just loved that. And I thought it was a really beautiful story in a way about aging and grieving for the life that you've lived and maybe the life that you imagined for yourself, and how that changes as you age. It was a fantastic time, and as someone who has a grandma who is in an elderly assisted living facility and who also has memory problems, it definitely hit different for me in terms of thinking about what her experiences are like, and just made the book feel a lot more real to me. So yeah, I really, really loved it and would highly recommend. I think if I was to rank all of these books 1 to 5, I think the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires would be number 1, just because it was so fun. We Spread would be number 2 because of just like unsettling edge that it had. I felt very unsettled reading it. Number 3 would be Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. 4 would be What Feast at Night by T. Kingfisher, and 5 would definitely be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that's the rankings. This was my Halloween vlog. Please tell me down in the comments below what spooky season reads you've had so far this year, or maybe which ones you recommend for my vlog next year. And if you haven't read anything spooky, just tell me what your favorite read has been for the month of October so far. And thanks so much for tuning in to hang out with me for a little bit today. As always, please be kind, read more books, and hit the subscribe button down below for more bookish content to come. I'll see you again soon.